Okay, this is the second part of my Nissan Pathfinder brake pad and rotor video, and this is obviously the rears. So just like when I was talking about the front, everything's going to be Brembo except for the parking brake pads, which are these ones, which are a Canadian Tire branded pad, and then the discs are going to be Brembo as well. Some of the supplies are shop towels and gloves. I do have thread locker, I have anti-seize, lots of WD-40, more shop towels, silicone brake grease, penetrant spray, that's pretty useful, brake cleaner, sockets, wrenches, breaker bars, 2 torque wrenches, a regular socket set, a drip pan, and some cleaning things, wire brushes, that sort of thing. And then I have a wood clamp for woodworking. Throughout I'm using axle stands and a jack and some wood blocking for protection. The dealer price for the entire job was $1,514, that's front and rear, and I paid about $500, which is better explained in the front brake video. Okay, in this video I'm mainly doing the back passenger side brakes. For this I'm using a 14mm socket and a 17mm wrench. This is to get the bolts off the back of the slide pins, and these are the same tools that I use for the front brakes, so no change. And then just like the front brakes, I'm just going to loosen up the top slide pin, so back the bolt off the top, and then I'm going to completely remove the bolt from the bottom, and that's going to allow me to swing the brake caliper upwards and then remove it from the brake caliper mounting bracket. These are only in with 20 foot-pounds of force, so they're not that difficult to remove. That's the bolt, and then like I said, the whole assembly can swing up and then be removed. Just be careful with the little rubber boot that is on the slide pin. The rubber boot locks in place, and if you just yank on the brake caliper, there's a risk that you could damage the boot. And just like on the front brakes, I really don't like this orange stuff. It looks terrible. I wish I did not buy it, but as a lubricant, I guess it works fine. It just looks like garbage. And then I'll remove the brake pads. The brake pads in the rear are actually pretty good. I would say the brake rotors in the rear are worse than the pads. I definitely could have reused these pads, but since the pads were on sale and I'm already doing a video anyway, I'll remove everything. And you can see that the brake wear indicator there's a little metal piece that'll squeal when it rubs onto the brake pad is on this one. So I don't think I'll ever have to replace the rear brakes on this vehicle again. I'll probably just do the fronts, but definitely this vehicle eats through the front brake pads a lot faster. On the front I used a breaker bar for this. This is a 17 mil, not a 19 mil like on the front. But I've changed my tactic a little bit, and I'm just using a wrench, and I bought a $15 dead blow, and I'm using that instead. I found the wrench is a little bit better to smack with the dead blow than a breaker bar because it doesn't flex as much. But either way, the bolts come out without too much difficulty, and the torque spec on the rear bolts is a little bit less, so I did find it a little bit easier to get these bolts off than the front. And I did pre-soak them with penetrant spray. Once those 2 bolts are out, the entire mounting bracket could come off. Looks like that. And the brake rotor is a little bit stuck on. It's not crazy. I'm going to use that dead blow hammer just to smack it around a few times, break some rust off this thing, and it breaks free pretty easily, much easier than the Mazda 3 when I did those brakes on the front of the vehicle. You can see the rotor's pretty rusty. Just like the front, I don't know, maybe I could have used the rotor again. It's got a pretty small contact patch on the inside, so I don't know. I didn't really measure anything. This is just eyeballing it, but obviously that could be the original brake rotor that came with the vehicle. So anyway, I'm going to replace them, doesn't really matter. Now if I wasn't replacing the parking brake pads, I would not be using WD-40 in here. I'd probably just be using brake cleaner, but I am using the WD-40 to clean everything up and get the grime off. And then I'm using some wire brushes and some Scotch-Brite pads and that kind of thing, just to get all the surface rust off and to make sure that the brake rotor is going to mount up flat as well. So that's what everything looks like after I've cleaned it up a little bit. To remove the parking brake pads, there are 2 springs, one on the top, one on the bottom. So I'm just removing the one on the top first that's underneath the brake actuator assembly. So that's that little metal thing that's in between the two parking brake pads. And then on each side of the brake pads, there are these retainer springs. You just need to give it a quarter turn, and once you give it that quarter turn, it should pop out of the hole that it's in. It's not a real screw. Then you could remove both brake pads at once. So if you just open up the top a little bit, and you can see the lower spring is there as well as the adjuster. I didn't really lubricate the adjusters in this. I probably should have, but maybe next time I do this, if I ever do it again. You do need to orient these in the correct manner. They're not the same at the top and the bottom. And you can see that the adjuster has a larger cutout in the metal and that the actuator has a smaller cutout in the metal at the top. So the actuator's at the top, small cutout, and then adjuster at the bottom with the larger cutout. You may or may not need the pliers to remove the lower spring that's near the adjuster. It really depends. And then the order you put these things back in, maybe it's easier to put the adjuster in first, I'm not sure. But I put the spring on and then I put the adjuster in. It would probably help to have a second set of hands here just to hold things together, but it is definitely doable by yourself. So there's the lower spring and adjuster put back on, and now I just need to put that over the brakes. One thing I did off camera is just put a little bit of that orange grease on all of the contact surfaces. Now you can see I put the brakes into position, mounted them up against the actuator, and this is really where a second set of hands would come in handy. Put the retaining springs back in. Again, it's just a quarter turn. You do need to find the little hole. Kind of hard to see the hole behind the brakes once you put them in place because it's dark, but it's not crazy. You can see the actuator sort of fell out there. That's okay. They do have some movement, so just need to put the actuator back into place. And then just need to put the upper spring back in. And this is the same process on both sides of the vehicle, so I'm only really showing the passenger side in this one. And you do need to make sure that that actuator is lined up properly and is sort of locked into place where it's supposed to go before you put this spring on, because obviously once the spring's on, it's not going to be easy to move anything. And once again, I'm using the needle nose pliers to pull on the spring and put it into place. Now before I clean the disc, I am going to get a feel for how tight the parking brakes are, and I am going to adjust them before I put everything back together. So you either open or close this little barrel nut. So right there, it's too hard to get the disc on, so obviously they're out too far. So I'm going to keep bringing it back in until I can get the brake rotor on. So after the first adjustment, it's still too tight, and I'm going to come in one more time, and then as soon as I can get them on, I back the brakes off 4 or 5 more clicks. And the thing that makes the click is the spring bouncing around on the little star wheel. So that's why if you have a manual on this, it'll say back it off 2 clicks. The click is just when the spring drops into the center of the star. I may have to tighten my brakes later on after driving it a little bit, but like I said, I got it snug and then backed the star off 4 or 5 clicks, and then that's pretty much it. And that's on both sides of the vehicle. I find the vehicle holds pretty well on hills. Maybe on a really steep hill, it won't hold, but it's pretty close, but I may need to adjust it. And I'm putting down some anti-seize before I put the brake rotor in place. And I'm also cleaning up the brake rotor with some brake cleaner before I drop it on as well. So just hit it with some brake cleaner and then take some shop towels and wipe it down. And that's to make sure that any of the factory oil and grease are off the disc. And then once the rotor's on the vehicle, I'm just taking 2 lug nuts and dropping them on to make sure the disc doesn't fall off or move around while I'm trying to do the rest of the brakes. You can see at the bottom there's also a little cutout, and there is a little rubber grommet that fits in there, and that's the viewing window for if you want to adjust your parking brakes later on in life. So you just take a flathead screwdriver, poke it through the viewing window to move that little star barrel wheel either tighter or looser. And you would probably need a flashlight to do that successfully. Now I am going to remount the caliper mounting brackets, And for the bolts, I'm putting blue Loctite on both. One thing to note, I do end up taking the mounting bracket off and really attacking the bracket with a wire wheel. So I do put it on. I don't show that, and it's just because the brake hardware doesn't fit in very well. But once I really scour it down with a wire wheel, it works well. So that's one thing I would have done differently, is to really scour these things down with the wire wheel first. And the torque spec I'm using for both of these bolts is 76 foot-pounds. Once the mounting bracket's on, I do take the slide pins back out, clean them up, and reinstall them into the brake caliper mounting bracket. And just like the front brakes, the slide pins are different, so you can't interchange them for the top and the bottom slide pin. Bottom needs to stay on the bottom, top on the top, and make sure that the rubber boot clips into the slide pin properly. So here's the upper slide pin. Like I said, not the same, don't get them confused. Once I got it cleaned up, re-lubricate it. And install it back into the mounting bracket. Here's where I use that woodworking clamp to back the piston off in the brake caliper. And one thing to note, I did take the top off the brake fluid reservoir up and under the hood. And it didn't overflow or anything like that, but I did use a syringe to pull out 15 milliliters of brake fluid. And then I'm just using some WD-40 brake cleaner, a wire brush, and some paper towel to clean up the caliper. And then I'll apply this nasty orange brake lubricant in here as well. So in the box, you do get the brake pad clips, which I do end up using in the end. And then obviously you get the brake pads. There's no springs on these ones like there are on the front. And I put these ones on, the ones in my hand, on the driver's side, and then I take the other ones and put them on the passenger side. And these are the ones that have the brake pad wear indicator, which is that little metal piece that's going to grind against the disc if your brake pads get too low. So I do drop the new clips in place. And you might see the old clips in different sections of this video, and it's just because I do take that mounting bracket off and then use a wire wheel on a drill to get it right down to bare metal. It's just because the rust was preventing the clip from seating properly. And like I said, on the driver's side, I went straight to the wire wheel and ground it down to bare metal for anywhere where those clips go, because it just caused the clip to sit funny. So that's why you might see the old clips in different shots here. And once the clips are in, I just take some of the brake lubricant that came with the Brembo brakes and put a little bit on those retaining clips. I do spray all these brake pads off with brake parts cleaner as well before I install them, so that's already been done, but it's probably dried off. And I also put some lubricant on the ends of the brake pads as well, and then put them in place. So like I said, you can see the old clips in there. I don't record all my frustrations here. I do use the old clips and they do work, but instead I do take that mounting bracket off. There's the wire wheel I use. I just ground all the rust off the caliper mounting brackets and then reinstalled everything. Put the new clips on, and just, same process anyway. You get the idea. I do add a little bit of lubricant to the back of each of the brake pads. You can see it there, just a smear. And then I take the bolts and put them in the back of the slide pins after putting the brake caliper in place. The bolts that go on the back of the slide pin, again, it's a 14 mil, and the torque specification I'm using is 20 foot-pounds. And that's the same for the top and bottom slide pin. And that's pretty much it. I remount the tire and torque the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Check the brake fluid reservoir, make sure I'm not overflowing. Give the brake pedal a few pumps, and that'll push the piston back out in the brake caliper. And then when I go to compress the driver's side brake, I'm not going to get an overflow of brake fluid. And this is the driver's side. I don't end up filming everything because it's the exact same process as the passenger side, and I didn't really notice any differences. Anyway, after getting the brake pads installed in the rear on both the passenger and driver's side, I do the brake bed-in process just like I did on the front. I go out into a secluded area, go for a drive, and do some hard stops, first from 60 kilometers an hour down to 10 kilometers an hour. I do that about 4 times, and then I go from about 80 kilometers an hour down to, again, 10 kilometers an hour. And I do that 4 times as well. And that's the entire process. Overall, I found doing the brake rotors and pads on this vehicle pretty easy, and I would say it took me about an hour to an hour and a half per wheel. So maybe on the long end, 6 hours. That's why I did it over 2 days, sort of 3 hours a day. And that's with filming. However, you do save about $1,000 by doing it yourself. So 6 hours isn't too bad of a trade-off, I found. Anyway, thanks for checking out my brake videos. Don't forget to like and subscribe.